The ancient wooden doors of Courtroom 302 creaked open as Sarah Matthews stepped inside. Her designer blazer couldn't hide the violent trembling of her shoulders, while Judge Henderson towered above from his bench like an imposing gargoyle. The afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows, cast long shadows across the marble floor as dozens of eyes focused on what should have been a simple case of high school vandalism but was about to become something far more extraordinary. The grandiose courthouse building itself seemed to hold its breath as Sarah made her way down the center aisle, her gauchy heels echoing against the polished floor like drum duets announcing the arrival of someone bound for the gallows. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched a small leather purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white as fresh snow. The pearls around her neck felt heavy like a chain weighing her down with each step she took. The gallery was packed with familiar faces from Lincoln High School teachers, administrators, and students alike, all gathered to witness what they believed would be the final nail in Brian Thompson's coffin. Principal Watson sat in the front row, his gray suit as pressed and proper as his stern expression, while Mrs. Hendricks, the chemistry teacher whose lab had been destroyed, nervously adjusted her glasses every few seconds. The damage to her beloved laboratory had been extensive, with specialized equipment worth more than some cars reduced to worthless debris. Judge Henderson shifted in his high-backed leather chair, his reputation for running a tight ship evident in the way every court officer stood at attention, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights that hung quietly overhead. His salt and pepper hair and deep-set wrinkles spoke of decades of experience, yet nothing in his 15 years on the bench had prepared him for what was about to unfold in his courtroom that afternoon. At the defense table, Brian Thompson slouched in his chair, wearing an ill-fitting suit that had clearly been borrowed, his usual rebellious demeanor subdued by the gravity of his situation. His public defender, a fresh-faced lawyer named James Chen, shuffled through papers with nervous energy while shooting concerned glances at his client. The evidence against Brian seemed overwhelming, yet he had maintained his innocence with a quiet determination that had surprised everyone. Detective Rogers stood near the prosecution table, his chest puffed out with pride at what he considered his most solid case of the year. The security footage screenshots spread across the table showed grainy images of a figure in that distinctive red hoodie entering the school at precisely 9:45 p.m. on the night of the incident, the same hoodie that had been found partially hidden behind a damaged storage cabinet in the ruined laboratory. Sarah felt the weight of her father's disappointment radiating from where he sat in the third row. Dr. Richard Matthews, chief of surgery at Memorial Hospital, had taken time from his busy schedule to witness what he assumed would be justice served against the hooligan who had destroyed expensive equipment and tarnished the school's reputation. Little did he know his own daughter was about to shatter his perfect image of her. The late afternoon sun continued its slow descent, casting prismatic patterns through the stained glass windows that lined the western wall of the courtroom. The dance of colors across the floor seemed to mock the somber proceedings as court officers directed latecomers to the few remaining seats. The murmur of whispered conversations created a low buzz of anticipation that filled the high-ceilinged room. Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished wood of the judge's bench. Her carefully applied makeup wouldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent wrestling with her conscience. The prestigious Yale acceptance letter that had arrived last week now felt like a cruel joke rather than the culmination of her life's work. She could feel the truth burning in her throat, desperate to escape despite the devastating consequences that would follow. The American flag beside Judge Henderson's bench swayed slightly in the breeze from the air conditioning vent, a silent witness to the proceedings that were about to upend everyone's expectations of justice, truth, and redemption. The court reporter settled into her chair, fingers poised over her stenograph, ready to document every word of what would become one of the most memorable cases in the county's judicial history. While the bailiff prepared to call the court to order, Detective Rogers strutted before the jury, pointing accusingly at Brian Thompson, the 17-year-old defendant whose dark reputation preceded him. Surveillance footage played on the courtroom screen showing a figure in a distinctive red hoodie slipping through the shadowy halls of Lincoln High School like a crimson ghost, while the detective smugly listed off Brian's previous incidents of graffiti and misconduct. The teen's shoulders slumped further with each damning detail. The seasoned detective moved with practiced confidence, his polished badge catching the light as he gestured toward the evidence table, where the red hoodie lay sealed in a clear plastic bag, its vibrant color seeming to pulse under the fluorescent lights. Like a beating heart of guilt, the security footage continued to play on loop, showing the hooded figure moving through the school corridors with surprising familiarity. That fateful night, when over $50,000 worth of scientific equipment was reduced to worthless debris. Brian Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Rogers described the graffiti incident from freshman year when crude drawings had appeared on the gymnasium wall. The time had been caught smoking behind the bleachers, and the infamous cafeteria food fight had allegedly instigated each minor infraction, building a portrait of delinquency that the detective wielded like a weapon, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he connected the dots for the rapt jury. The prosecution had arranged their evidence with meticulous precision, photographs of the destroyed laboratory equipment laid out in chronological order, showing the devastating path of destruction: broken glass, shattered microscopes, and spilled chemicals, creating a timeline of chaos that seemed to point unequivocally to the figure in the red hoodie. The school janitor, Mr. Martinez, had taken the stand earlier, describing how he had discovered the devastation during his morning rounds, his testimony adding another nail to Brian's coffin. From her seat in the gallery, Sarah Matthews' grip on her leather purse tightened, her knuckles white as paper as Detective Rogers produced phone records showing a cell tower ping near the school. At the time of the incident, the detective was building his case like a master architect, each piece of evidence another brick in the wall of certainty. He was constructing around Brian Thompson, the troubled kid from the wrong side of town, who everyone had already decided was guilty. James Chen, Brian's public defender, scribbled furiously in his notepad, occasionally adjusting his crooked tie while searching for holes in the detective's testimony. But Rogers was a veteran of countless trials, his responses calculated and confident as he detailed how the forensics team had found traces of the distinctive blue chemical powder used in advanced chemistry experiments on the sleeve of the red hoodie, a damning piece of physical evidence that seemed to complete the prosecution's puzzle. Principal Watson nodded along with each point the detective made, his presence in the front row lending institutional weight to the prosecution, while Mrs. Hendricks dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Rogers displayed photos of her beloved laboratory in ruins. The financial loss to the school was significant, but the emotional impact on the dedicated teacher seemed to resonate even more strongly with the sympathetic jury. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom as Detective Rogers approached his conclusion, his voice taking on an almost theatrical quality as he described the moment of Brian's arrest. The teen's protests of innocence, dismissed as typical behavior from a young man who had finally gone too far in his acts of rebellion. The detective turned to face the jury directly, his expression stern as he emphasized the importance of sending a message about accountability and consequences. Brian Thompson stared at his hands, avoiding the accusatory glances from the gallery, his borrowed suit hanging loose on his thin frame, making him look younger and more vulnerable than his tough guy reputation suggested. The weight of his past mistakes seemed to press down on him like a physical force, even as he maintained his innocence in whispered conversations with his overwhelmed defender. The red hoodie on the evidence table seemed to mock him, its presence a scarlet letter of presumed guilt. Detective Rogers finally returned to his seat beside the prosecutor, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the jury members exchanging knowing glances. His case appeared airtight, supported by physical evidence, security footage, witness testimony, and the defendant's own troubled history. The afternoon light filtering through the high windows created a spotlight effect on Brian Thompson, isolating him in his presumed guilt, while Sarah Matthews felt the truth burning in her throat like acid, desperate to escape. The air grew thick with tension as Sarah rose from her seat, her pristine white dress and perfectly styled hair, marking her as everything. Brian was not the star student council president and daughter of the town's most prominent surgeon, moved as if in a trance, her Louboutin heels clicking against the floor like a metronome, counting down to the explosion that was about to rock the foundations of justice itself. Every head in the courtroom turned to watch her unexpected movement, the sudden silence deafening as even the gentle hum of the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Detective Rogers paused mid sentence, his triumphant expression faltering as the golden girl of Lincoln High School, the last person anyone would expect to disrupt proceedings, made her way toward the front of the courtroom, her steps measured but determined like a lamb walking willingly to slaughter. Dove Matthews half rose from his seat in the gallery, his face a mask of confusion as he watched his daughter move against all protocol, his perfectly planned world about to shatter like the delicate glass beakers that had been destroyed in the laboratory that fateful night. Beside him, his wife Elena gripped her designer handbag, her freshly manicured nails digging into the expensive leather as maternal instinct warned her that something momentous was about to unfold. Sarah could feel the weight of her Yale acceptance letter in her purse, the crisp envelope that had once represented everything she'd worked for now felt like a burning coal against her side, the prestigious university seal, a mark of Cain rather than achievement. Her whole body trembled, but her spine remained straight, years of deportment classes and society expectations holding her together like invisible steel bands, even as she prepared to shatter her carefully crafted image. Brian Thompson looked up from his dejected pose, his eyes widening with recognition as he remembered the countless hours Sarah had spent helping him understand chemical equations and molecular structures in the very laboratory that now lay in ruins. Their tutoring sessions had been his only hope of passing chemistry and possibly graduating, but now those memories took on a different weight as he watched her approach the bench, his mouth slightly open in dawning comprehension. Judge Henderson peered down from his elevated position, his years of experience failing to prepare him for this unprecedented interruption from the girl whose academic achievements and community service had been featured multiple times in the local newspaper, the same girl who'd won the state debate championship and organized fundraisers for the Children's Hospital, the very embodiment of teenage perfection, now stood before him like a ghost in white, her presence demanding attention. The court reporter's fingers hovered uncertainly over her stenograph as Sarah cleared her throat, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom like a gunshot. Principal Watson leaned forward in his seat, his usual administrative confidence wavering as he watched his star pupil, the girl had written glowing college recommendations for prepared to speak, while Mrs. Hendricks, the chemistry teacher, removed her glasses to clean them nervously, a habit she displayed only in moments of extreme stress. Detective Rogers had instinctively taken a step backward, as if Sarah's presence at the front of the courtroom represented a physical challenge to his carefully constructed case, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the badge that represented his authority and certainty, a certainty that seemed to waver as the unlikely scene unfolded before him. Even the most hardened court officers watched with unconcealed interest, their usual professional detachment cracking in the face of such an unusual development. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah opened her mouth to speak, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows, creating a halo effect around her blonde hair, the picture of innocence about to shatter its own illusion. Behind her in the gallery, her best friend, Madison Andrews, gripped the wooden bench so hard her knuckles turned white, somehow knowing that whatever Sarah was about to say would change everything, their shared secrets and whispered confidences about to explode into the public sphere. The American flag hung limp in the corner of the courtroom, as if even it held its breath, waiting for the words that would transform this routine case into something extraordinary. James Chen, Bryan's public defender, had stopped his nervous shuffling of papers, his legal pad forgotten, as he stared at the approaching figure of Sarah Matthews, the girl who had just thrown his carefully planned defense strategy into chaos before she'd even spoken a word, while his client sat straighter in his chair, hope beginning to dawn in his eyes for the first time since his arrest. Whispers erupted through the gallery as Sarah approached the bench, her manicured fingers leaving crescent-shaped marks on her palms from clenching them so tight Brian Thompson's head snapping up in shock as he recognized not just another privileged student, but the girl who had tutored him in chemistry last semester, while Judge Henderson leaned forward, his steel-rimmed glasses catching the light like twin moons in the hushed courtroom. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to follow Sarah as she moved, creating shadows that danced across the marble floor like dark prophecies of what was to come. Her white dress glowed almost ethereally in contrast to the heavy dark wood of the courtroom, making her appear both angelic and ghost-like as she stood before the imposing bench, where Judge Henderson watched with unprecedented uncertainty in his usually confident gaze. Brian couldn't tear his eyes away from her, his mind racing back to those after-school tutoring sessions where she had patiently explained molecular structures and chemical reactions, her voice always kind, never betraying any of the prejudice or disdain that had come to expect from the other privileged students at Lincoln High. The red hoodie on the evidence table seemed to pulse with new meaning as his defense attorney James Chen gripped his pen so hard it threatened to snap in half. Detective Rogers had unconsciously taken another step back, his usual commanding presence diminished by the unexpected interruption, his carefully constructed case suddenly feeling like a house of cards in a growing wind as Sarah Matthews, the last person anyone would suspect of involvement in this case, stood ready to speak, her perfectly composed exterior beginning to crack like fine porcelain under extreme pressure, while the jury leaned forward in their seats, collectively holding their breath. Elena Matthews had grabbed her husband's arm with such force that her expensive tennis bracelet dug painfully into both their flesh, but neither noticed as they watched their daughter. The perfect achieved everything always made them proud daughter stand before the court like a defendant awaiting sentence. Dr. Matthews' prestigious medical career and carefully cultivated social status seemed to waver in the air like a mirage in the desert as his daughter prepared to shatter their family's facade. Mrs. Hendricks, the chemistry teacher whose destroyed laboratory had sparked this whole investigation, pressed her hand to her mouth as recognition began to dawn in her eyes. She had always praised Sarah as her best student, the one who stayed late to help clean up equipment and prepare for the next day's experiments, the one who had access to the laboratory keys, the one whose failed experiment had never been recorded in the official grade book, despite the approaching end of semester. Principal Watson's face had drained of all color as he watched the scene unfold, his decades of experience in education having taught him to read subtle signs in student behavior, and Sarah's unusually rigid posture and tight expression spoke volumes about the weight of whatever she was about to reveal. Behind him, Madison Andrews, Sarah's best friend since kindergarten, had begun to cry silently, mascara tracking down her cheeks as she watched her friend's perfect life balance on the edge of destruction. Judge Henderson removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, buying time to process this unprecedented situation. In his 15 years on the bench, had never seen anything quite like this. The daughter of one of the town's most prominent families, standing before him uninvited, unscheduled, about to speak words that would undoubtedly change the course of this seemingly straightforward case, his weathered hands betraying a slight tremor as he replaced his glasses. The court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys, as the heavy silence in the courtroom grew almost supernatural in its intensity. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old courthouse building seemed muted, as if the very walls understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The American flag hung still in its corner, no breeze from the air conditioning daring to disturb this moment, frozen in time as Sarah Matthews opened her mouth to speak, her voice barely a whisper but carrying to every corner of the hushed room. Sarah's voice trembled but grew stronger with each word as she described sneaking into the lab wearing Brian's borrowed hoodie, her desperation to fix a failed experiment that threatened her full-ride scholarship to Yale, the prestigious future her father had mapped out since her childhood, hanging by a thread while she worked in the darkness, her hands shaking so badly she could barely handle the delicate equipment. The truth spilled from her lips like water from a broken dam, unstoppable now that the first crack had appeared. She described how she had convinced Brian to lend her his hoodie, claiming she needed it for a drama club performance. The lie had come so easily then, just another small deception in a life built on maintaining perfect appearances. How she had waited until the janitors finished their evening rounds before slipping into the school through the gymnasium entrance she knew would be unlocked for the basketball team's late practice. Dev Matthews had collapsed back into his seat, his face ashen as his daughter continued to speak, revealing how she'd spent weeks planning the break in, studying the security cameras, blind spots, memorizing the janitorial schedules, all while maintaining her flawless GPA and running student council meetings. Her mother's quiet sobs from the gallery provided a haunting soundtrack to Sarah's confession, while Madison Andrews pressed her hands against her mouth, trying to stifle her own crying. Detective Rogers stood frozen, his case file hanging limply from his fingers, as Sarah described picking the lock to the chemistry lab, a skill she'd learned from YouTube videos during sleepless nights spent obsessing over her failing grade. The security footage playing silently on the screen behind her now seemed to mock his certainty, showing the hooded figure he had so confidently identified as Brian Thompson moving through the halls with the graceful, purposeful movements that now clearly belonged to the school's star student athlete. Mrs. Hendricks had removed her glasses entirely, her hands trembling as Sarah detailed the failed experiment that had started everything, the complex chemical reaction that had gone wrong despite multiple attempts, the approaching deadline for final grades that had pushed her toward desperate measures. The chemistry teacher remembered marking that failing grade with such disappointment, never imagining it would lead to this moment as her star pupil confessed to breaking into the lab to recreate and falsify her results. Brian Thompson sat straighter in his chair, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she spoke about borrowing his hoodie, his mind racing back to that day when she'd approached him after their tutoring session. Her request seemed so innocent, then had even felt proud that someone like Sarah Matthews would ask him for help now. He watched as she shouldered the burden of guilt that had been weighing him down for weeks, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Judge Henderson gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white as Sarah revealed how she'd planned to adjust just one small part of her failed experiment, but panic had set in when she heard unexpected noises in the hallway. Her usually steady hands had knocked over the first shelf of equipment, starting a chain reaction that sent thousands of dollars worth of specialized instruments crashing to the floor. The scholarship that had seemed so crucial mere weeks ago now felt hollow in the wake of her destructive choices. The jury members exchanged glances, their previous certainty about the case crumbling as Sarah described fleeing the scene, leaving Brian's hoodie behind in her panic. The distinctive red fabric that had seemed like such damning evidence now transformed into a symbol of prejudice and hasty judgment. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor like bars of a prison cell, while Sarah Matthews' perfect facade finally shattered completely under the weight of her own words. Elena Matthews had buried her face in her hands, unable to watch as her daughter continued to dismantle the carefully constructed image of perfection they'd spent years building. Her quiet sobs echoing through the hushed courtroom, while Sarah spoke about the sleepless nights that followed, the guilt that ate away at her as she watched Brian Thompson be arrested and charged, knowing she alone was responsible for the destruction that had cost the school so dearly and nearly cost an innocent classmate his future. The courtroom collectively held its breath as Sarah described the moment everything went wrong, the sickening crash of the first shelf giving way, followed by the domino effect of destruction, each piece of equipment adding to the symphony of chaos. But she stood frozen in horror, watching her perfect life shatter along with thousands of dollars worth of scientific instruments, her panic driving her to flee, leaving behind the red hoodie that would wrongly condemn Brian. Her voice grew hollow as she recalled the deafening sound of breaking glass, the specialized microscopes imported from Germany crashing to the floor like rain, the shelf of delicate measuring equipment toppling with the grace of a falling tree, the expensive spectrophotometer Mrs. Hendricks had written 3 grant proposals to acquire, shattering into worthless fragments of metal and glass. Sarah had watched helplessly as each piece of equipment contributed to the cacophony of destruction, like some terrible orchestra playing the soundtrack to the end of her perfect life. The memory of that night played out in vivid detail as she described how the motion sensor light had suddenly flickered on, startling her, causing her already trembling hands to knock against a precariously balanced shelf of chemicals. The first bottle of hydrochloric acid hitting the ground had started a chain reaction that no amount of quick thinking or academic excellence could stop. The acrid smell of mixing chemicals filling the air as container after container joined the growing pool of mingled substances on the floor, creating toxic rainbows in the harsh fluorescent light. Madison Andrews gripped the courtroom bench, her knuckles white as she remembered Sarah calling her at 2 in the morning that night, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Now the full truth of what had happened emerged in the hushed courtroom, how Sarah had stripped off Brian's hoodie in blind panic, leaving it behind as she fled through the emergency exit, her designer shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed hallway floor, the sound of destruction still echoing in her ears as she ran into the cool night air. Detective Rogers shuffled uncomfortably as Sarah described, hiding in the shadows of the school parking lot, watching as the night janitor discovered the damage and called the police, her guilt and fear warring with her instinct for self-preservation as she heard the approaching sirens, the red and blue lights painting the school walls like some twisted artwork, while she crouched behind her father's luxury sedan, unable to move, unable to confess, unable to do anything but watch as her actions set in motion a series of events that would nearly destroy another student's life. Mrs. Hendricks dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Sarah detailed the exact sequence of the destruction, how the falling shelf had caught the corner of the lab station, toppling years' worth of carefully maintained equipment, the expensive molecular modeling kits, scattering across the floor like expensive confetti, the specialized glass beakers and test tubes creating a treacherous carpet of broken dreams, while the night air rushing in through the ventilation system stirred loose papers into a frenzied dance above the wreckage. Brian Thompson sat motionless as Sarah described her desperate attempt to stop the cascade of destruction, reaching out with trembling hands only to cause more damage, her fingers brushing against another shelf, sending a row of textbooks tumbling into the delicate feet meters that had been calibrated just that morning, the sound of plastic cracking and electronic components splitting apart adding to the symphony of destruction, while his red hoodie snagged on a broken cabinet door, hanging like an accusatory finger in the darkness. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to dim as Sarah recounted fleeing down the empty corridors, her footsteps echoing off the walls, while behind her the damage continued to spread, chemicals mixing with broken glass, creating small rivers of destruction that flowed across the laboratory floor, the emergency exit alarm adding its shrill voice to the chaos as she burst through the doors into the night, leaving behind not just destroyed equipment, but also her carefully maintained image of perfection, and was still an innocent person to take the blame. Judge Henderson sat motionless, his usual commanding presence softened by the weight of the confession before him. Brian Thompson, who had maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, despite mounting pressure to accept a plea deal, stared at Sarah with a mixture of relief and compassion that seemed to transform his entire demeanor, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the courtroom as 15 years of judicial certainty began to crumble in the face of unexpected truth. The seasoned judge removed his glasses for the third time in as many minutes, a gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil as he processed the implications of Sarah Matthews' confession, his mind racing through countless cases where he'd felt equally certain of guilt or innocence, now faced with incontrovertible proof that appearances and assumptions could be devastatingly wrong. The weight of every judgment had ever made seemed to press down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. Brian Thompson straightened in his chair, the borrowed suit no longer seeming to swallow him whole as the truth of his innocence filled him with a quiet dignity that transformed his presence in the courtroom. His public defender, James Chen, had stopped his nervous fidgeting, finally looking like the confident lawyer he'd trained to be, while Detective Rogers shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smugness replaced by a dawning recognition of how prejudice and presumption had nearly claimed another victim. The gallery had erupted into whispered conversations that rolled through the courtroom like waves on a troubled sea. Principal Watson sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, as he watched his star pupil, the girl had praised in countless college recommendation letters, strip away the carefully constructed facade of perfection to reveal the desperate truth beneath. While Mrs. Hendricks clutched her hands together, her destroyed laboratory suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the human drama unfolding before her. Sarah stood unwavering now, her confession having granted her a strange new kind of strength, even as tears continued to track down her face, leaving trails in her perfect makeup like rivers carving new paths through familiar terrain. Dr. Matthews had aged years and minutes, his prestigious medical career and carefully curated social status offering no protection against the tide of truth that had swept through the courtroom, laying bare the pressure had placed on his only daughter. Elena Matthews had stopped crying, her initial shock giving way to a mother's instinct to protect her child even as she struggled to reconcile the perfect daughter shed thought she knew with the desperate young woman who had been driven to such lengths by the weight of expectations and the fear of failure. Madison Andrews reached across the gallery to grip her best friend's mother's hand, offering silent support as the carefully constructed world of the Matthews family crumbled in the harsh light of truth. Detective Rogers' case file lay abandoned on the prosecution table, the damning evidence had collected with such satisfaction, now transformed into a testament to the dangers of assumption and bias. The red hoodie, that had seemed like such conclusive proof, now spoke more to the prejudices of the system than any actual guilt, while the security footage continued to play silently on the screen, its grainy images a reminder of how easily truth could be obscured by preconception. The afternoon sun had shifted during Sarah's confession, casting new shadows across the courtroom, as if nature itself were acknowledging the transformation taking place within these walls. Brian Thompson caught Sarah's eye for a moment, their shared glance speaking volumes about pressure, privilege, and the unexpected bonds that would form in the crucible of truth, his forgiveness evident in his gentle nod. While Judge Henderson watched this silent exchange, his judicial detachment cracking in the face of such raw human drama. Time seemed suspended in the courtroom as Judge Henderson cleared his throat, preparing to address this unprecedented situation, his years of experience offering no clear precedent for a case where the star witness had transformed into the confessor, while the accused sat vindicated by the very truth that would condemn his former tutor. The weight of justice and mercy hung in the balance as the judge considered how to proceed. His next words would need to bridge the gap between law and humanity in a way that acknowledged both the courage of confession and the consequences of actions. Detective Rogers shuffled through his case files with newfound uncertainty, while the prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the unexpected turn of events. Sarah continued to stand there, her perfect reputation crumbling with each word, but her conscience finally clear, the weight of truth hanging heavy in the air like storm clouds about to break. The veteran detective who had solved countless cases throughout his career now found himself confronting the bitter taste of presumption, his carefully assembled evidence transforming from a testament to thorough police work into a damning indictment of systemic bias. The security footage, still playing silently on the screen, seemed to mock his earlier certainty, the grainy images of a figure in a red hoodie, now telling a completely different story than the one had so confidently presented to the jury. District Attorney Margaret Collins rose from her seat at the prosecution table, her crisp navy suit and perfect posture a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around her. 20 years of prosecutorial experience had prepared her for a star witness transforming into a confessor. Her case notes now seemed like a house of cards built on assumptions and prejudices that had nearly sent an innocent young man to jail. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the wooden table as she contemplated the legal implications of this stunning development. James Chen had stopped taking notes entirely, his legal pad abandoned, as he watched his client's vindication unfold in real time. The young public defender, who had faced subtle dismissal from his more experienced colleagues, throughout the trial now sat straighter in his chair as his instinct to believe in Brian Thompson's innocence, proved justified the weight of defensive arguments, had prepared now unnecessary in the face of this unexpected truth, while his client seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier certainty dissolving like sugar in rain. Some avoided looking at Brian Thompson, guilt evident in their expressions as they recalled their whispered conversations during breaks, where they'd already decided his fate based on nothing more than his reputation and appearance. Others stared openly at Sarah Matthews, their faces reflecting the shock of discovering that privilege and perfection could mask desperation and guilt just as easily as a troubled past could hide innocence. Principal Watson had loosened his tie, his usual administrative confidence shattered as he confronted the realization that his own prejudices had contributed to this situation, had been so quick to believe the worst of Brian Thompson, never questioning why one of his most troubled students would risk breaking into the very laboratory where he was finally showing improvement. Through Sarah Matthews, tutoring the truth forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own leadership and the environment he'd fostered at Lincoln High. Mrs. Hendricks pulled a fresh tissue from her purse, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, as she realized how she'd missed the signs of Sarah's desperation during those final weeks of the semester, the extra hours her star pupil had spent in the lab suddenly taking on new meaning, the careful questions about security protocols and janitor schedules now revealing themselves as reconnaissance rather than academic curiosity. Her destroyed laboratory seemed a small price to pay for the lesson in compassion and judgment unfolding before her. The afternoon sun had shifted during Sarah's confession, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor like prison bars, a fitting metaphor for the cage of expectations and assumptions that had trapped everyone in their predetermined roles. Detective Rogers, standing rigid as his professional reputation teetered on the edge, Sarah Matthews, finally free from the prison of perfection she'd built around herself, and Brian Thompson, emerging from the shadow of prejudice that had nearly cost him his future. Madison Andrews watched her best friend from the gallery, her own guilt evident in her tears. She'd known something was wrong with Sarah in the weeks leading up to the incident, but had been too caught up in her own life to probe deeper. Now she understood the true cost of silence as she watched her friend sacrifice everything to finally speak the truth. The friendship bracelet they both wore seemed to tighten around her wrist, a reminder of promises made and secrets kept until this moment of reckoning. Judge Henderson cleared his throat several times before finding his voice again. The courtroom remained in stunned silence as he declared a recess to consider this startling development, marking one of the most unexpected moments in his 15 years on the bench, while Sarah Matthews, the perfect student whom no one had suspected, stood ready to face the consequences of her actions, her shoulders straight despite the weight of truth that now rested upon them. The late afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, painting the courtroom in amber hues as the judge removed his glasses with trembling hands, his weathered face revealing the internal struggle of a man whose certainties had been shaken to their core. The heavy wooden gavel that had pronounced countless verdicts now seemed to mock him from its resting place as he contemplated the complexity of justice in a world where appearances could be so devastatingly deceiving. Dr. Matthews had finally risen from his seat, his prestigious medical career offering no guidance in this moment of personal crisis, as he watched his daughter transform from the perfect achiever into something far more human and perhaps more admirable. Elena Matthews clutched her husband's arm, their carefully curated social status crumbling around them while their daughter stood in the harsh spotlight of truth, her confession having torn away the facade of perfection they'd spent years building. Brian Thompson remained at the defense table, his borrowed suit no longer seeming like a costume, but rather a symbol of the dignity had maintained throughout his ordeal. James Chen sat beside him, frantically scribbling notes, as the young public defender realized his first major case would become a landmark example of how prejudice and presumption could corrupt the very system designed to protect the innocent. The red hoodie on the evidence table seemed to glow in the fading sunlight, a beacon of truth in a sea of assumptions. Detective Rogers stood rigid by the prosecution table, his badge catching the light as he struggled to reconcile his years of experience with the revelation that his certainty had nearly condemned an innocent young man. His case file lay open before him, the carefully assembled evidence, now reading like a cautionary tale about the dangers of confirmation bias and the ease with which facts could be twisted to fit preconceived narratives. Sarah's voice had grown stronger with each word of her confession, as if the truth itself provided the strength she needed to stand before the court. Her Yale acceptance letter, burning a hole in her designer purse, by Principal Watson watched his star pupil with a mixture of disappointment and dawning respect. The carefully crafted college recommendations had written now seemed hollow in comparison to the courage it took to stand up and speak the truth. Mrs. Hendricks had stopped cleaning her glasses, her hands finally still, as she realized that her destroyed laboratory had become the catalyst for a moment of profound truth and justice. The broken equipment and ruined experiments paling in comparison to the human drama that had unfolded in this courtroom. Her star student and troubled pupil both teaching her lessons about judgment and redemption that no textbook could contain. Madison Andrews gripped the gallery railing, her mascara-stained cheeks testament to the emotional toll of watching her best friend sacrifice everything for the truth. Their shared secrets and whispered confidences in crowded school hallways now seemed trivial compared to the weight of this moment as Sarah stood before the court ready to accept whatever consequences awaited her confession. The jury members shifted in their seats, their earlier certainty replaced by uncomfortable self-reflection as they confronted their own rush to judgment. Some avoided looking at Brian Thompson, shame evident in their downcast eyes, while others watched Sarah with a mixture of admiration and dismay, the truth having forced them to confront their own biases and assumptions about guilt, innocence, and the masks people wear. Judge Henderson finally raised his gavel, the sound of it cutting through the heavy silence like a knife as he prepared to address the court, his 15 years on the bench having taught him that justice was rarely as simple as it seemed. The afternoon light cast his shadow long across the courtroom floor as he faced the task of balancing law and mercy in a case that had transformed from a simple matter of vandalism into a profound lesson about truth, courage, and the complex nature of human dignity.